Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Eivor Martinus tonight. Eivor and I are old friends and have a joint past in as much as we have both lived in the Swinglish community in London for more than 50 years. And we've often met up at the church, at networking events, and at our society. You may remember that Eivor has been our speaker once before. In March 2013, she gave us a talk on Strindberg and love. Eivor has been writing her own and translating other people's books for the last 50 years. Her first novel was actually published in 1971. Most recently, she has written several biographies, one about King Henry IV's daughter, Philippa, who very early in the 15th century, at a very early age, married the Swedish king Erik of Pomerania. In 2016, Eivor later then published a book chronicling the last 10 years of her husband David Martinus's life. And the most recent but one of her books is an autobiography of sorts about her own families, their lives from 1850 to present day. Eivor has translated 15 plays by Strindberg, 12 of which have been published and performed in the UK. And she also translated Per Lagerkvist's Barabbas, which she put up and had performed in the Swedish church in London. I very much look forward to learning now about Katarina, a hugely influential yet overlooked figure from Swedish history, as it said in the invitation. Most Swedes of our generation, maybe I should add, will have read at school about den heliga Birgitta, Saint Birgitta, but I think very few of us know anything about her daughter Katarina and her influence.
Is that on your phone, Richard?
Yeah.
Alexander has promised to field your questions after Eivor's talk. Over to you, Eivor.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good evening. And thank you for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to be asked to talk about my latest book, I Skuggan av ett Helgon, In the Shadow of a Saint. Unfortunately, the book is written in Swedish, and I have no plans at the moment to translate it into English. But it's always possible that I could change my mind later about that. My Strindberg biography and my book about Alzheimer's were written in both languages, after all. In the Shadow of a Saint is the 5th book that I have published with Carlson Publishers, a medium-sized publishing house in Stockholm, with some very good people working for it. So I'm happy to be in their stable, so to speak. Happy that they still want my books, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to get published. And many authors and would-be authors resort to self-publishing, which can turn out to be a very costly adventure. It struck me when I started to plan this talk that an earlier book, which I published in 2014, The Child Queen Philippa and Her World, has a strong link with my latest book. They are both about women, young women, and they're both set in the Middle Ages. The women are remarkable, but not unique for their time. There were many clever and creative women around in the 14th and 15th century. And even though women were barred from the same kind of education as men, they often managed to garner enough knowledge to excel anyway. They joined their brothers during their lessons, and they asked their brothers to share the knowledge after the lessons. Saint Birgitta joined her brother, for instance, and later on, she sat in on her son's lessons. But before I talk about Birgitta and her daughter, I want to say a few things about Philippa, because she carried on Birgitta's work and enlarged upon it. Philippa's father, Henry IV of England, was very progressive and made sure that his two daughters were well educated before he married them off to high-born men. The girls started Latin lessons at the age of 3, and textbooks from that early age still exist. Philippa was the daughter of a king and a sister to the famous King Henry V, who won the Battle of Agincourt. She was one of 6 children whose mother had died in childbirth at the age of 26 only. So Philippa never knew her mother. She died while having Philippa. It was very common in those days, unfortunately. Among Philippa's other siblings were John of Bedford, who executed Joan of Arc, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who founded the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Her sister Blanche, who married the much older Archduke of Bavaria at the age of 10 and had her first child at 14, but died in childbirth while having her second baby when she was only 17. It's not unrealistic to assume that Philippa was affected by these events and that they colored her relationship with her husband in Scandinavia later on. Apart from a stillborn child, she never had any more children. Neither her mother nor her sister had survived their pregnancies. That was scary. But when Philippa came to Sweden in 1406, 12 years old, it was only 15 years since Saint Birgitta had been canonized. So she came to a country which had its own native saint. And what is more, her sainthood was so recent that there was still a lot Philippa could do to promote Birgitta's religious order and help out in the abbey in Vadstena. This gave Philippa a purpose in her new country. And because she knew Latin, she could write the necessary letters to cardinals and popes. All serious correspondence was written in Latin. She had also grown up with French, which was still widely used in court circles and among the nobles in England, although her father had decided that French was not going to be spoken in the Houses of Parliament anymore. It was during his reign that English was introduced in the Parliament. Philippa quickly learned a kind of mixture between Danish and Swedish. In the Middle Ages, the two Scandinavian languages were closer to each other than they are today. Philippa spent a lot of time in the newly founded Vadstena Abbey, and she donated large sums of money to the convent. She also asked to become a soror ab extra, a sister without the need to live in the convent. In Philippa, Vadstena Abbey gained a very important ally and sponsor, someone who was closely connected to Birgitta. She also persuaded her brother Henry V to build a sister convent in England, one of the first outside Sweden. It was Sion Abbey, which was situated opposite Kew Gardens, in the grounds of which is now Sion House. Some of the ruins are still there, but the abbey was pulled down during the Reformation, and Duke of Northumberland then built a magnificent mansion instead. So while writing my book about this young girl, Philippa, I obviously covered quite a lot about Birgitta as well. Philippa was a faithful follower of the Bridgettine order, but although Birgitta features a lot in the Philippa book, I wasn't at that point tempted to write a separate book about Birgitta. After all, there were so many books written about her already, so why should I venture into that field unless I could add something unique, something new and different? In the 90s, I had written a play about Birgitta, which was staged at an international women's playwrights conference in Ireland, but I hadn't done anything else about that play. Maybe I could link the story about Birgitta with the present, I thought. Maybe I could focus on her daughter, Katarina, of which not much was known. As you can hear, I wanted to write about Birgitta and her daughter, but I simply didn't know how to approach the subject. I think Alexandra has a few pictures here which we could put in. They are illustrations from my book, and the first one is of Birgitta, and the second one is Birgitta riding, and while riding, she has a revelation about the Bridgettine order, Piazza van der House in Piazza Farnese. That house is standing still today. It's the house where Birgitta and Katarina lived in for a very long time, and Birgitta died in this house, Piazza Farnese. It's obviously been modernized a lot since. And we even have a room where Birgitta supposedly died, which I photographed when I was there. This is the room. It's a very small room. And this is a charming sculpture of Birgitta from one of the churches in Sweden. Thank you. That's all the only pictures. Thank you. So I left these two women and jumped to another subject. The book wasn't going to be only about Birgitta and Katarina, I decided. The starting point and the focus was going to be somewhere else. I had been wondering about holiness for quite a long time. What is it? How do we recognize it? And why did people in the Middle Ages go on long pilgrimages in search of holiness? Was it fear of punishment, remorse, fear of purgatory and hell? All those things mattered, of course, and people were easily persuaded, even though much of their beliefs seemed quite implausible. People went to holy places in the Middle Ages. Most families who could afford it would go on at least one pilgrimage during their lifetime. There were some holy sites in Scandinavia too. St. Olof in present-day Skåne, and Nidaros, Trondheim, where St. Olof lies buried, for instance. Many families also went further afield to Santiago de Compostela and Rome. And the absolute top location was, of course, Jerusalem. Birgitta's parents had been to Compostela, and Birgitta and her husband Ulf went too in the early 1340s. They were away 2 years during that pilgrimage. On their way home, Ulf fell ill and nearly died in France. And Birgitta had a revelation that God wanted her to do great things. The couple then decided that if Ulf survived, they would settle at Alvastra Monastery when they got home and stay there with the monks and lead a religious life. And so they did. Ulf died there in 1344, but Birgitta stayed on for a few more years, to the annoyance of the monks, who for obvious reasons didn't want a woman living with them. Why could she not go and live in Vreta nunnery with the other women? My guess is that she enjoyed the intellectual company of men more than that of women. During this period after Ulf's death, she had several revelations, and in 1349, she finally got a group together and set off for Rome. Birgitta was a rich and powerful woman, a mother of 8 children. She had been married for almost 30 years. She had traveled widely, and now, when she had reached an age when the majority of people were already dead, she was setting forth on her greatest adventure so far. It became abundantly clear that I couldn't leave her out of my story any longer. I simply had to include her. So the next big question was, how was I going to tackle the subject? Was it possible to link her story with anything today? The obvious similarity was, of course, the plague and the pandemic. The whole of Europe was in the grip of the most awful Black Death, and corpses were left stranded on the roadside because priests were afraid of touching the bodies and catching the disease. Could I link the story with my own, make it personal? Which voice was I going to adopt? That is a common question whenever I start a new book. There were many questions to be answered before I could start writing. Birgitta's search for holiness was the key point. I had wondered about holiness and why so few people are interested in finding out more about it. It has lost its luster today. We are in the West part of a secular society, and religious fervor is often regarded with cynicism and suspicion. Why is that, I asked myself, and why does it mean so little today when it occupied the whole existence for people in the Middle Ages? What is holiness anyway? Have we got a definition for it? I happen to know a number of clergymen, so I asked them what they thought of holiness. And that became the starting point of the book. The clergymen spoke, and they differed slightly. I hadn't written anything like this before. In my portfolio, I had a biography on Strindberg written in both languages, first in English and then in Swedish. And after that, the book about the child queen Philippa, followed by another book about Alzheimer's. That was a very personal book, and it generated a lot of interest both in the press and among people who were working with Alzheimer's in some way. So the following book, which was a memoir about 2 very different families, made up my roots. I traced a hardworking family in Gothenburg back 100 years and did likewise with a reserved, better off family in Dalarna, family on my father's and my mother's side. And here I was now, asking existential questions, writing about thoughts, doubts, faith. Was it my advancing years that had pushed me in this direction? Had I reached a contemplative stillness? Maybe this was the end of me as a writer, I thought. I kept telling people that this was my last book, my swan song. I had, after all, spent 50 years writing in a professional capacity. I decided to dive in and divide the subject into 3 parts in the end, like 3 journeys. First, one inner journey, when I included episodes from my own experiences, episodes which had a great impact on me, experiences of great beauty in nature, heightened moments of love and sorrow, possibly touching on holiness. That was going to be the emotional journey. The second journey was a journey in time. It took me back to the Middle Ages, where I felt comfortable. I'd been there before, after all, with Philippa, and I had more than 3 bookshelves full of literature about the Middle Ages. So it felt reassuring. That was the historical journey. The third journey was a journey in the company of holy people, and that's where Birgitta and Katarina fitted in. And that was the spiritual journey. Birgitta was very experienced in many fields when she came to Rome. She had been magistra for the young Queen Blanche, who was married to the king, Magnus Eriksson. Being a magistra meant that she was a mentor, a teacher to the young queen. She taught Blanca court etiquette, customs, and Swedish. Birgitta stayed at the royal court in Stockholm for 1 year, and during that year, her children were farmed out to various convents. Katarina would have been only about 4 years old when this took place. And that meant that she spent 1 whole year from 4 to 5 in a convent. Her brother Bengt was also put in a convent, as was Ingeborg, who was going to spend the rest of her short life in a nunnery. The eldest daughter, Märta, was already married, and the 2 eldest sons, Karl and Birger, were allowed to stay at home with their father and study grammar and Latin. Gudmar was a sickly child, so Birgitta brought him with her to Stockholm, where he died during her year at the royal court. Her last child, Cecilia, was probably born after Birgitta had returned from Stockholm. So between the age of 16 and 35, Birgitta had given birth to 8 children and survived the ordeal. Well, none of the children died in infancy, but 2 boys died before they entered their teens. And Ingeborg was only 21 when she died in the Dominican nunnery as a nun. Birgitta had been a mistress of a large manor in Östergötland, a province southwest of Stockholm, for almost 30 years. There she had tended to the sick and the poor, and she had built a kind of cottage hospital where she looked after the sick, often on her own, but sometimes with the help of her children, especially Katarina. She was also knowledgeable about herbs and medicinal plants. She joined her sons during their Latin lessons and spent all her life trying to improve Latin. She was also very competent in law, having been married to a lawman or lawgiver and being the daughter of another. There were several men in her family who were trained in law. And that was generally considered the most important position in the country after king and queen. Birgitta was related to the royal family, and it is known that she even had hopes for her eldest son, Karl, to become king one day. She spoke in very derogatory terms about the reigning king, Magnus Eriksson, and criticized him widely, even from Rome. Despite this, he made a huge donation to Vadstena, which enabled her to build her abbey there, although she never saw it completed. But her daughter, Katarina, became the first abbess of Vadstena. And one of her granddaughters, a daughter of Märta's, also became abbess of Vadstena over a period of many years. Another one of her granddaughters became a mentor for Queen Philippa when she arrived in Sweden. So the 2 families were closely linked from the beginning. Birgitta's power of persuasion was impressive, and she used her large network of important friends frequently. Many people, both in Sweden and later on in Italy, sponsored her in different ways. She managed to get a group of about 20 people together when she set off in 1349, the year of the plague. She walked or rode along the routes in Europe where corpses lined the roads. She was fearless and confident that she was not going to catch the lethal illness and die. Some of her followers died on the way to Rome, though. When the group reached what is today southern Germany, the company stopped for several days to give the horses some food and rest. And when they were about to leave, The farmer demanded to be paid for the use of the field. Birgitta then decided to buy the field. And after having purchased it, she went into the village and told the poor people of the village that she had bought the field and she was now giving it to them. The plague killed 20 million people in Europe. In Sweden alone, 20,000 people died. Their arrival in Rome was a great disappointment. The city had recently had an earthquake and nothing had been repaired since. Rome was totally neglected. Animals were grazing in the churchyards, buildings were falling apart, and priests charged for administering the Holy Communion. The roads were muddy and hard to walk on. It must have been a huge disappointment for Birgitta to come to this derelict city, which was so different from the holy city she had imagined. Rome was a sad sight, and the Pope wasn't there. She walked from church to church with the other pilgrims, helped people whenever she could, and soon she became well known for her charity. She prayed several times a day, and when she prayed, she lay down flat on the cold church floor, spread out in the shape of a cross. 1 year after Birgitta's arrival in Rome, her daughter Katarina arrived. She was then 18, and she had left Sweden with her husband's permission, although her elder brother Karl thought it was very wrong of her to leave her husband for such a long time. He had even challenged her husband to a duel if he let her go, but with the help of Birgitta's brother, she got away. She traveled with a group of people from her neighborhood, and the rest of the group were determined to return to Sweden in time for Christmas. It's difficult to say what exactly Katarina was hoping for during her stay in Rome, but she decided to remain there after her fellow travelers had returned to Sweden. By that time, Birgitta had realized what a great help Katarina could be to her, so she wanted her to stay, and it turned into a tug of war. Katarina was soon feeling homesick. She missed her family and friends. She missed her husband, Eggard. She missed the scenery around Ulvåsa. And she missed the relative calm at home compared to the frenzy in Rome. She had freedom in Sweden. In Rome, she constantly had to hide from the men who were chasing her. Her homesickness became more and more unbearable, and soon she was desperate to leave. Katarina then went to her mother and asked her if she would allow her to leave and join her husband in Sweden. Birgitta prayed to God and asked him to help Katarina get over her homesickness so she could stay on with her in Rome. In a revelation, God said to Birgitta, "Tell your daughter that she's now a widow and she's going to stay here." There had been no news of Eggard's death, and he had been perfectly healthy when she left him. But soon after Birgitta's revelation, Katarina got a message that Eggard had indeed died and she was now a widow, like her mother. A widow and a virgin, doubly attractive to God, according to Birgitta. Katarina was still downhearted though. So Birgitta went to Petrus, her confessor, and asked him what he suggested was the best way to make Katarina change her mind and stay with them. He suggested that they give her a birching to beat the thoughts of homesickness out of her. So he started to beat Katarina with a birch. That was how they were going to beat the homesickness out. After a long session of this, Katarina finally said, "That is enough. My homesickness has now gone."
Mm.
They put away the birch and Katarina gave in. Her time in Rome was becoming very difficult. Katarina was a beautiful, tall, blonde girl, and she soon caught the attention of many Italian men who pursued her, tried to abduct her, and proposed to her. She found it increasingly difficult to avoid these men, and she didn't want their attention. After a while, Birgitta and Petrus locked her up in the house when they went out. So Katarina sometimes felt like a prisoner. She even self-harmed to make herself less attractive. She got depressed, seriously depressed, and took to her bed. She stayed there day after day and didn't move. When Birgitta demanded that Katarina spoke to her, Katarina simply whispered, "Mother, I can't speak." Her face was very pale and the whites of her eyes were prominent. Petrus then picked up the birch and started to beat her again, because her depression was considered a work of the devil, and you had to beat it out. The more I read about Birgitta's and Katarina's relationship, the more I found myself preferring the daughter to the mother. It was sometimes hard to reconcile oneself with the notion that Birgitta was holy. She blurted out so many horrible things about people whom she didn't like or approve of that it's surprising nobody attacked her. Was it her social position that protected her, or her contacts who were very influential? She certainly had some very close friends in high places. And for many years, she was lent a house belonging to a cardinal. She stayed in that house until she died there. And it's still standing in Piazza Farnese, and a new branch of Bridgettine nuns live there now. So what did they do all day except pray? Praying was a very important part of their daytime activity, but they also studied Latin and wrote letters. Birgitta especially wrote to the Pope, and she experienced 3 different popes while she was living in Rome. She urged them to come back to Rome because they had settled in Avignon for decades. Life was easier there, food was good, the wine was good, and they didn't need to deal with all the problems in Rome. Birgitta was adamant. The Pope should be in Rome, where the church was founded. St. Peter lay buried there, and the Vatican was the rock of the church. Her struggle to get the Pope back to Rome went on the whole time she was alive. It wasn't until after her death that Katarina witnessed the Pope's permanent return to Rome. Birgitta had written to Pope after Pope, with clear outlines about her religious order. She'd given all the details in her revelations, and now she needed the Pope's permission to establish this new order. 100 years previously, the then Pope had declared that no new orders were to be established, and Birgitta suggested an order where both men and women would live together, although not under one roof. The furthest Birgitta managed to go during her lifetime was getting permission from the Pope to join an already existing order, the Augustinian order. That meant that the Bridgettine order would be subordinated to the Augustinians. Birgitta refused. She wanted her own independent order, where they would be financially independent and where a woman would be in charge of both the nunnery and the monastery. That was quite a tall order, and it took several more years and more popes before it was approved. Another remarkable achievement was that she translated the first 5 books of the Old Testament. In her time, there was no translation of the Bible. Not until after the Reformation was it allowed to translate the Bible into the various indigenous languages. It is odd that Birgitta decided to translate the Old Testament rather than the New Testament, which is the Christian part of the Bible. Her sons, Carl and Birger, visited Birgitta several times over the years. When they learned that Birgitta planned a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1370, they wanted to join as well and arrived in time to be given a lesson on how to behave in front of the Queen, because they were going to be guests at Queen Giovanna of Naples before leaving for Jerusalem. Giovanna was a known beauty, but she was also ruthless with men, and it was rumored that she had murdered her first husband. And Birgitta and her 3 children arrived in Naples. Giovanna was married for the 3rd time. Birgitta gave her sons a lesson in courtly manners. First, you kneel in front of the Queen, she instructed her 2 sons, and then you kiss her foot. Birger did as he was told, but Carl looked at the ravishing Queen and kissed her on the mouth. Birgitta, there's some background sound here. Birgitta was outraged. Both Carl and Giovanna were married, and according to Birgitta, they had committed a mortal sin.
Yes, but it's okay, darling. I'm going into the other room.
But Giovanna fell in love with the handsome Swede and made him her lover. But soon afterwards, Carl died all of a sudden, probably of a fever. And Birgitta, oddly enough, was relieved because now Carl couldn't commit any more mortal sins. She railed against Giovanna and called her a slut and a drab. So the company set off without Carl, and their journey went via Cyprus, where Birgitta found more outrageous, lecherous behavior among the population. When they were approaching Jerusalem, they ended up in a violent storm and were shipwrecked. All their belongings fell overboard. Birgitta and Katarina were rescued by a fisherman and rowed to ashore in a small rowing boat. Once in the Holy Land, Birgitta had several powerful revelations. When they were visiting Bethlehem, she saw, for instance, how Jesus was born, and her depiction of the birth was later used by artists in the 15th century, and in art thereafter, which shows what an important influence she had on many people. When they were staying in Jerusalem, she saw how Jesus died and conveyed it to her fellow travelers. On their return to Naples, they stayed with Queen Giovanna again. But by now they had run out of money, and they didn't even have enough money to get back to Rome. So Giovanna very kindly lent them a sum for their journey. It was early 1373 when they got back to Rome, and Birgitta only had about 6 months left to live. She carried on visiting the various churches for several months still, but when she was too weak to walk the long distances, she stayed at home in the house of Piazza Farnese, and at the beginning of July, she began to doubt whether there was a God. She looked at the host, and it was only a piece of bread. She looked at the wine, and it was simply wine, not the body of Christ or the blood of Christ. And how could it be? The 70-year-old woman who had spent all her life serving God had lost her faith. Her son and daughter, Birger and Katarina, and the people who were surrounding her were horrified. This serious crisis lasted a few days, but then she was told, again in a revelation by God, which day she would die in July. She was being supported by Katarina and Birger, and she died peacefully on 23rd of July, as predicted. Her remains were put in a coffin, and Katarina and Birger organized the trip back to Vadstena. They were given passes and money for the journey by generous friends and cardinals, and they set off on a 6-month-long journey with their precious cargo. When they got to Gdansk, in what is now Poland, Katarina found her voice and stood up in front of the crowd, and in a strong voice, she condemned the Teutonic League who had performed some awful atrocities on civilians. She spoke with great aplomb, and people marveled at her confidence. It was as if Birgitta's spirit had lived on in her daughter, and now, when Birgitta was dead, Katarina had taken over the reins. When they arrived with the coffin at Vadstena, the town was full of people who had heard of their impending arrival and who wanted to greet their famous daughter. Katarina stayed in Vadstena for 2 years to set up the convent, and she acted as abbess. Less than 2 years later, in 1375, she returned to Rome to start the whole process of canonization. She gathered witnesses from many people and presented them to the Pope. All this took a long time, and she spent some time in Naples securing the help of their old friend Giovanna. When it looked as if the canonization would be taking place, she decided to go back to Sweden. 5 years had passed since she was there last. She had worked tirelessly to promote her mother from that day. And in 1380, Katarina was back in Sweden, but by this time she was seriously ill with cancer. So unfortunately, she was never going to see her mother being made a saint. When she reached the end of her life, she couldn't even swallow, so the priest held the sacrament in front of her, and she could just look at it through a glass. In March 1381, she died. 100 years later, in 1489, new proceedings started to try and persuade the Pope to make Katarina into a saint as well. The first stage towards sainthood, beatification, took place, but the Reformation got in the way, and Sweden decided to do without saints and the Catholic Church in the future. Katarina got to that first stage, at least, in 1489, when she became Beata Katarina, the first step towards sainthood. Katarina was a selfless, self-sacrificing person who gave up everything to serve God and her mother. Birgitta was finally canonized in 1391. By then, all her children except her youngest daughter Cecilia had died. There's no record of Cecilia attending the great feast in Birgitta's honor in October 1391. She had seen very little of her mother while she was alive, so she probably didn't know her very well. Cecilia decided to spend her last years, when she was a widow for the 2nd or 3rd time, in Vadstena convent, although she didn't wish to be a nun. These were the 2 holy women I followed on my 3rd journey, Birgitta and Katarina. They were inspirational, outstanding, and entirely of their time. It's hard to imagine 2 women like them in today's society, but I may be wrong. What conclusion did I come to then after my long journey, after my 3 journeys? Holiness is hard to define. It's fleeting and maybe something that comes to us in short glimpses if we are observant. For me, it was interesting to study the link between Birgitta and the young Queen Philippa, who did so much for the Bridgettine order. Today, There are around 40 Bridgettine nunneries around the world, 3 in Sweden, 1 in Djursholm, 1 in Falun in Dalarna, and 1, of course, in Vadstena. And there's 1 here in England. Most of the others are in India or Mexico. And to end this talk, I just want to show you the book, my book about this, all this that I've been talking about. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. I see a lot of applause on the screen. Well earned indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to throw the screen open. There's a little heart on the screen from Emma. Yeah. So I'm going to say who would like to kick off with a question? Wilhelm Engström. You need to unmute. No, we can't hear you. You need to unmute.
Better?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Right, sorry. It's a completely different setup from previous Zooms I've been to. However, one of the more interesting, more modern points of discussion about Birgitta was, of course, how he clashed with King Magnus Eriksson and the language he used to criticize him, which was quite remarkable in those days for an outsider to do. You mentioned briefly that the daughter had a clash with the Teutonic League. Did she, at any point after her return to Sweden, meddle in Swedish politics like her mother had done?
No, she didn't. No. She helped. She was very helpful towards many bishops had been seeking her help. And because she knew about depression, for instance, I can't remember the name of that particular bishop, as one bishop who was depressed. Of course, in those days, there was no psychiatrist or therapist. So he went to Katarina, and Katarina could actually help him so he could carry on with his work afterwards. She was more the carer than the politician. Birgitta was much more sharp-tongued.
Who's up next? Eva Roberts.
About her Saint Birgit's revelations, there's been said something that it could be a benign brain tumor. Is that just to dismiss completely, or have you got any views on that?
Well, she lived to the ripe old age of 70, which in those days was very, very old. To live to be 70 was quite extraordinary. And she did so much, and she was so busy for so many years after the main revelations. The way she was living in Italy, I doubt that she was impaired in any way, really, mentally. I don't think so. I mean, some other people have said that revelations could be like sort of hallucinations because she starved herself quite often. So she was probably, anorexic, and that could have brought on the revelations or the lively sort of hallucinations, if you like.
I'm going to say Nick Elif.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Alexander. Yeah. So I'm going to declare an interest for a start. I'm both a Swedophile and a Catholic, an ardent Catholic as well. So I kind of come at Bridget from two angles. And in fact, I live in Birmingham, where until last year there was a Bridgettine order. So I was very familiar with seeing Bridgettine nuns in the oratory in Birmingham, and they had a good relationship with John Henry Newman, who's a local modern saint, or relatively modern, as a 19th century saint. But I'm interested in how such an archetypal Catholic saint, who's obedient, produced a lot of children, whose daughter's feast day is the day before the main feast day of Our Lady, how she became patron saint of Sweden, which by contrast with the Catholic Church, I think is probably one of the most secular countries in Europe. So I was quite interested in that, and then how she became patron saint of Europe as well. It's kind of, well, perhaps a typically Swedish contradiction between her extreme Catholicism, if you like, and the, by contrast, secular, or at least at best Lutheranism of Sweden.
Well, Sweden hung on to quite a lot of Catholic sort of customs, didn't they? And we have our Lucia, for instance. And I talked to one of the clergymen, because I discussed the sort of subject with 6 priests before I started, the Protestant priests. And they were saying that, you know, it's Sweden is different from Norway and Denmark when it comes to their religion. We are hanging on to many more, what shall I say, the customs or you know, than they are. We don't have the sort of stark cassocks that they have, for instance. They like in the Swedish church, you'll often see very colorful, beautiful clothes. We are a funny lot. I think we are a strange lot, because the churches, we don't have incense, but we have pictures. You can go to the Swedish church in London, you'll see icons, for instance, and lots of candles. So I don't think it's...
I was going to say the Bridgettines are remarkable for the, when they're not modern nuns, they're old-fashioned nuns, and they wear their crowns with the 5 jewels and all that sort of thing. So that they're even by kind of Catholic standards, they're quite, I want to use the words extreme, but they're quite ardent Catholics, if that's a good way of putting it.
They're very approachable. I mean, I have visited the nuns in Vadstena on several occasions, and they're very approachable and very easy to have private talk with them. And you can discuss.
Sadly, they've left Birmingham because of the pandemic, because they were looking after students at Maryvale, and their nunnery is closed down in Birmingham now, which is very sad for the city.
Yes.
I'm going to give Neil Kent, Professor Neil Kent, for those who don't know him, a professional historian, the next question. No pressure.
What I wanted to ask you, I enjoyed that very much indeed. If you had any comments to make, for example, 2 things which haven't been brought up. There is now, for the first time, a Roman Catholic Swedish cardinal, the Catholic Bishop of Stockholm. And there is now I believe, Jesuit seminary in Uppsala that's reopened, the first one since the early 1600s. So, and I've been led to believe that at least amongst those adhering to Christianity, there are more converts to Catholicism and people active in it than there is to any other Christian denomination in Sweden today.
It's interesting.
So I wonder your views on that.
Well, it's, I mean, I talk mainly, I've talked to, there was a bishop who wrote the foreword to my book, for instance, a Protestant bishop, you know, and I talked mainly to people of the Church of Sweden. But that bishop who wrote the foreword, he said to me that more people than ever are going on pilgrimages. More people are going to church now than they did 30, 40 years ago. And I don't know whether it's only that they convert to Catholicism, or whether it is simply that they're interested in religion, in the Christian religion in a new way, which I didn't perhaps before. I can't answer that. It's too, I need to find out more before I can say something, you know, about that.
Thank you.
And over to Ridian, and then we will move to Peter Berg. But Ridian.
Thank you very much, Eivor. Like you, I live in West London, within striking distance of Scion Park. So it's
Oh,
always been very close to my heart. And I have stayed in the Kloster Hotel in Vadstena and been
yes.
the equivalent of a monk for a night. But my question is about is it right to say that Birgitta was more of a bureaucrat than a divine? If you like, there's this big question. There's this big question about Marjorie Kemp in Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen in Germany. I mean, they were essentially, if you like, producing theology from their visions, whereas Birgitta seems to have been producing a bureaucracy. Is that unfair?
I think that's probably too simple. I mean, Birgitta was a very complicated lady. Marjorie Kemp, of course, followed in her footsteps all over Europe. She was devoted to Birgitta, you know. I think Birgitta was brilliant, and her mind never stopped. I mean, she was involved in the French-English War, the 100-Year War. She was interfering with the King of Sweden. She was hoping to put her own king on the throne of Sweden. She was political, but she was also immensely religious. There's no doubt about that. But then I found it very hard to swallow the way she treated her children. I mean, she farmed them out, all of them. But of course, she would have had many, many servants when she was at home. And the fact that she was not at home, then, you know, the monasteries and the nunneries was to her the best place to put the children. Whether it was the best place for as far as the children were concerned is another matter. Can't really see the bureaucrat or the bureaucracy as the main thing. She was multifaceted, but she was also, I thought at times, foul-mouthed and really cruel. I mean, she was cruel, I thought, but this is judging from today's customs. I mean, the way she treated Katarina, I can't really swallow that.
I think the point I was really kind of questioning is, does someone produce spiritual guidance and produce texts and so on, or does someone actually create an order? I mean, that's where I was saying she's a different category of person.
Yeah. Well, her order, I mean, she has wrote it all down, very detailed, and I can't even remember all the details, but she wanted it very simple. So her church should be very simple with clear glass. She didn't want to go in for the stained glass, for instance. And she didn't really want music. That was over the top, she thought. The human voice was enough. It was a simplification. It was, in a way, trying to go back to basic, the early Christianity. But when people say that was she a sort of beginning of the Reformation, Catholics would say no, not at all. It wasn't, you know, she was very firmly a Catholic, but she wanted to reform the Catholic Church. It wasn't that she wanted something new. She was fed up with corruption and well, the way that the priests and the bishops lived, you know, totally immorally. And the fact that the Pope wasn't where he should be, that sort of thing irritated her immensely. She wanted order. She was a bit like a headmistress who wanted order around her. But Katarina was different.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got time for maybe a question or two. Nick is raising his hand again. Hello, Nick.
Yes, sorry, it's a completely different question, actually. Eivor, towards the end of your talk, you kind of raised the question, which seemed odd to me, that I think it was Birgitta you were talking about, had doubts about the transubstantiation. which I find kind of even in Henry VIII in England passed laws which said it was illegal to deny the transubstantiation. So, and that was good 2 centuries later. So I was surprised. But what was the evidence that she denied?
Well, I mean,
or had doubts about the transubstantiation?
Well, this was on her death, practically on her deathbed. She died just a few days later, and this is what was so horrific to her 2 children who were with her at the time, and also I think to the others. And this woman who had spent all her life, from her early revelations as a child, and all through her life, she had devoted her whole life, given away her belongings and her wealth in Sweden, that she suddenly, when she's facing death, says, I don't know whether I believe in God. I mean, that is quite extraordinary. But it was just I talked to the nuns in Bridgettine about that, and they said, well, doubt is good. They told me, doubt is very good. I said, well, that's a nice thing to say, yes. Because I couldn't understand, but it was, we have to remember it's a glitch, it's a short time, and then she recovers from that. And she dies believing.
Well, apparently Teresa of Calcutta had 50 years of doubts, so she's not alone.
No, according to the nuns of Bridgettine, doubt is good for us.
Yeah.
Peter Berry wants to ask a question.
Thank you very much for this clear and thought-provoking presentation. This isn't so much a question, but it's one for the Roman Catholics. Our great friend Magnus Persson was commissioned in the 1980s to make a copy of a statue of Katarina in a church called Ekeby, not so far in Uppland. And this was finished in 1989, and it was blessed by the Pope at the time. So they're not many Swedish Pope sculptors who've been patted on the head by a Pope, but Magnus was one of them. Thank you very
wonderful. Much. Thank you. Thank you for that information. How wonderful. Thanks.
I think that ends us on a lovely note. I'm going to say thank you so much to Eivor and to Elisabeth for hosting and introducing and so on. I'm going to just plug 2 books. This Strindberg and Love is still available, I believe, on Amazon and other places. And I'm going to also show an out-of-print one, which is Pia in London, where I have a dedication from Eivor. Till Alexander med hjärtlig hälsning Eivor Martinus, 21st of the 11th, 1974, and it's one of my prized books, I have to say.
Wonderful.
I'm also going to say that you are a past honorary secretary of the Anglo-Swedish Society, and at least twice a speaker, and we enjoyed this evening very much. So if you would accept complimentary membership of the Anglo-Swedish Society, we would be very honored.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll take that as a yes then. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Well, really, on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much, and thank you everyone who asked a question and everyone who turned up and are lovely, loyal members for being part of the society. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.